The howling wind rattled the shutters of every building in Aurora, Colorado, as death embraced Bethany Winters in its cold arms. Her wrists, bound with rough rope to the wooden post outside the saloon, had gone numb hours ago. The bitter December night of 1872 would be her last, she was certain, as snow collected on her shoulders and ice formed on her eyelashes. Her crime being in the wrong place at the wrong time, knowing too much about the wrong people had earned her this cruel sentence. Zachary Irving had been riding for 18 hours straight, his stallion's hooves barely making a sound in the fresh fallen snow. He'd been tracking the Blackwater gang across 3 counties, and Aurora was his last hope of catching them before they disappeared into the mountain passes. The bounty hunter had no intention of stopping in this God-forsaken town for more than a hot meal and perhaps an hour's rest. But fate had other plans. Through the swirling snow, he spotted a figure slumped against a post outside the dusty Diamond Saloon. At first, he thought it was a drunk sleeping off his liquor, but something about the silhouette didn't sit right. As he drew closer, the moonlight revealed golden hair dusted with snow and the unmistakable curve of a woman's shoulders. "What in tarnation?" Zachary muttered, dismounting his horse. His spurs jingled as his boots hit the ground with a soft crunch. He approached cautiously, one hand resting on his Colt revolver. The woman's head lifted slightly at the sound, revealing a face both beautiful and desperate. Her blue eyes, glossy with unshed tears that had frozen on her lashes, met his. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Please help me." Zachary didn't hesitate. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the ropes binding her to the post. As the final strand broke, she collapsed forward, her body too cold and weak to support itself. He caught her against his chest, noting how her skin felt like ice against his hands. "Who did this to you?" he asked, wrapping his heavy duster around her trembling form. "Sullivan," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "Reginald Sullivan and his men. They think I witnessed their robbery at the bank in Denver." Zachary's jaw tightened. Sullivan was one of the Blackwater gang's most notorious members. It seemed his hunt had led him right where he needed to be after all. "Did you?" he asked, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird in his grasp. "I saw nothing," she whispered, her head falling against his shoulder. "But they don't believe me." Zachary looked around the empty street. The saloon lights still burned, but no one had come outside to see what was happening. Either they were oblivious to her presence, or worse, they knew and had chosen to do nothing. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, carrying her toward his horse. "Bethany." "Bethany Winters." Her voice was growing weaker, her consciousness fading. "And you, Zachary Irving," he replied, settling her onto his horse before mounting behind her. He cradled her body against his chest, trying to transfer some of his warmth to her. "But most folks just call me Zach." "Thank you, Mr. Irving," she murmured, her head lolling back against him as her consciousness slipped away. Zachary looked down at the woman in his arms, feeling a strange protectiveness sweep over him. The Blackwater gang could wait. Right now, he needed to get Bethany Winters somewhere warm before the cold claimed her completely. With a click of his tongue, he urged his horse forward, holding Bethany securely as they rode through the snow toward the only light still visible at the end of the street, the Aurora Inn. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Holbrook, opened the door with suspicion written across her face, but her expression quickly changed to concern when she saw the half-frozen woman in Zachary's arms. "Lord have mercy," she gasped. "Bring her in, quickly." Zachary carried Bethany into the warm building, feeling her stir slightly as the heat from the roaring fireplace reached them. Mrs. Holbrook led him to a small room on the ground floor, hastily turning down the quilts on the bed. "This poor child, Mrs." Holbrook tutted as Zachary laid Bethany gently on the mattress. "I heard Sullivan and his boys were in town, but I never thought." "Who is she?" Bethany Winters, Zachary replied, removing his hat and placing it on the bedside table. I found her tied to a post outside the Dusty Diamond. She says Sullivan thinks she witnessed their bank job in Denver. Mrs. Holbrook's hand flew to her mouth. Those monsters. I'll fetch some warm bricks for the bed and heat some broth. You stay with her, Mr. Irving. Zachary Irving. A flash of recognition crossed the innkeeper's face. The bounty hunter. Well, I suppose it's a good thing you came along when you did. She bustled out of the room, muttering about providence and guardian angels. Left alone with Bethany, Zachary removed his gloves and gently touched her forehead. Her skin was ice cold, her breathing shallow. Acting on instinct rather than propriety, he began to rub her hands between his, trying to restore circulation to her frozen fingers. Miss Winters, he said firmly, I need you to stay awake. Can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, revealing those striking blue eyes again. Cold, she whispered. So cold. I know, he replied, continuing his ministrations. But we need to warm you up slowly. Can you tell me where you're from? Bethany swallowed with difficulty. St. Louis. I came west, to teach. Aurora School needed a teacher. Zachary nodded, encouraging her to keep talking. A school teacher. How long have you been in Aurora? 3 weeks, she said, a bit stronger now. Was visiting my aunt in Denver when the bank was robbed. I was across the street. I didn't see their faces, but Sullivan doesn't believe me. Mrs. Holbrook returned with heated bricks wrapped in flannel, which she placed around Bethany's body. She also carried a steaming mug of broth. Can you sit up, dear? She asked, already helping Bethany into a more upright position. This will warm you from the inside. Zachary supported Bethany's shoulders as Mrs. Holbrook helped her sip the hot liquid. Color slowly returned to her cheeks, and her shivering began to subside. Thank you, Bethany murmured, her eyes meeting Zachary's. You saved my life. He shook his head. Just happened to be passing through. God sent you, Mrs. Holbrook declared, patting Bethany's hand. Now, I'll prepare another room for Mr. Irving. No, Zachary interrupted. If Sullivan and his men are still in town, they might come looking for her. I'll stay here, keep watch. Bethany's eyes widened in fear. You think they'll come back for me? I don't know, Zachary admitted, but I'm not willing to take that chance. Mrs. Holbrook nodded grimly. I'll bring you some food and coffee, Mr. Irving, and I'll have my son fetch the sheriff in the morning. After the innkeeper left, Zachary pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, his revolver resting on his thigh. You're a bounty hunter, Bethany said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes, madam, been tracking the Blackwater gang for almost a month now, and I've led you right to them. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Seems that way. Zachary couldn't help but return her smile. Though I'd prefer it had happened under different circumstances, Bethany's expression sobered. Will they come back for me? Zachary considered lying to reassure her, but something in those blue eyes demanded honesty. It's possible. Sullivan doesn't strike me as the type to leave loose ends. She nodded slowly, accepting his frankness. Then I'm grateful you're here, Mr. Irving. Zach, he corrected her. If I'm going to be your bodyguard, you might as well use my given name. Zach, she repeated, his name soft on her lips. And you should call me Bethany. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection neither had anticipated but both felt with startling clarity. Mrs. Holbrook's return with a tray of food broke the moment. Zachary accepted the plate of stew and bread with thanks, while Bethany managed another half-cup of broth before exhaustion overtook her. Rest now, Zachary told her as her eyelids grew heavy. I'll be right here. As Bethany drifted into sleep, Zachary settled more comfortably in his chair, his mind working through his next steps. The Blackwater gang was within his grasp, but now he had Bethany to consider. His mission had suddenly become more complicated and somehow more important. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the small room at the Aurora Inn, A different kind of storm was brewing, one neither Zachary nor Bethany could have predicted. The night passed slowly for Zachary, who remained vigilant in his chair, dozing only in brief intervals. Each time he woke, his eyes immediately went to Bethany, checking that she was still breathing, that color had returned to her cheeks. By morning, the worst of the danger from the cold had passed, though she remained weak and feverish. Mrs. Holbrook brought breakfast: early hot coffee, flapjacks with maple syrup and bacon. The smell roused Bethany from her fitful sleep. "Good morning," Zachary said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Bethany pushed herself into a sitting position, wincing at the soreness in her arms and shoulders. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she admitted with a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to you." "The sheriff should be here soon," Zachary told her, passing her the coffee. "He'll want to hear what happened." Bethany's hands trembled slightly as she took the cup. "What will happen after I tell him? Sullivan has friends in this town. I've seen them drinking together at the saloon." Zachary's expression darkened. "That explains why no one came to help you." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Bethany, after you speak with the sheriff, I think it would be best if you left Aurora." Her eyes widened. "Leave, but my position at the school, my students." "Your life is more important," Zachary said firmly. "Sullivan won't stop coming after you, especially if he believes you can identify him." Bethany stared into her coffee cup, her shoulders slumping. "I have nowhere to go. I used every penny I had to come west." Before Zachary could respond, a knock at the door announced the sheriff's arrival. Sheriff Thornton was a tall man with a silver mustache and tired eyes. He removed his hat as he entered, nodding respectfully to Bethany. "Miss Winters, heard you had quite an ordeal last night." His tone was professional but not particularly sympathetic. "That's putting it mildly, Sheriff," Zachary interjected, standing to his full height. "Miss Winters was left to freeze to death, tied to a post in plain view of half the town." Sheriff Thornton's eyes narrowed at Zachary. "And you are," Zachary Irving, "bounty hunter." "I've been tracking the Blackwater gang." Recognition flashed in the sheriff's eyes. "Irving, I've heard of you. They say you never lose your mark." "I haven't yet," Zachary confirmed, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The sheriff turned his attention back to Bethany. "Miss Winters, can you tell me what happened?" Bethany recounted her story, how she had been visiting her aunt in Denver when the bank was robbed, how she had been across the street but hadn't seen the robbers' faces, and how Sullivan had confronted her 3 days ago, accusing her of being able to identify him. "He and his men dragged me from my boarding house last night," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "They said they were making an example of me for anyone who might think about talking to the law." Sheriff Thornton jotted notes in a small book. "And you're certain it was Reginald Sullivan?" "Yes," Bethany said firmly. "He introduced himself to me at the school when he first came to town, said his nephew might be joining my class." The sheriff closed his notebook. "Well, I'll look into it." "Sullivan and his boys left town early this morning, according to the stable boy at the livery." "And you're just going to let them go?" Zachary demanded. Sheriff Thornton gave him a cold look. "I didn't say that, but I've got one deputy and Sullivan has at least 5 men with him. I'm not about to get myself killed chasing after them without a plan." "I'm going after them," Zachary stated. "That's your business," the sheriff replied with a shrug. "But Miss Winters should leave town. Sullivan has friends here, as I'm sure she's discovered. I can't guarantee her safety." After the sheriff left, promising to send a telegram to the federal marshal, Bethany looked at Zachary with renewed fear. "What am I going to do?" Zachary paced the small room, thinking. "I have a cabin," he said finally, "about 30 miles from here in the foothills. It's remote, hard to find if you don't know where to look. You could stay there while I track down Sullivan." "Alone, in the wilderness," Bethany's voice rose slightly. "It's safer than staying here," Zachary insisted, and it won't be for long. Give me 2 weeks to bring Sullivan in, 3 at most. Bethany considered his offer, anxiety clear on her face. Do I have a choice? You always have a choice, Zachary said softly. But if you stay here, I can't protect you, and if you go back east. Sullivan could follow me, she finished for him, and my family would be in danger too. She squared her shoulders, a determination settling over her features. When do we leave? As soon as you're strong enough to travel. Tomorrow morning, perhaps, Mrs. Holbrook brought lunch and helped Bethany bathe and change into clean clothes she'd borrowed from her daughter. By evening, Bethany was able to walk around the room unassisted, though her ordeal had clearly taken a toll. As they shared a simple supper, Zachary found himself watching Bethany more closely than was proper. There was something about her, a resilience beneath her gentle exterior that intrigued him. She caught him looking and held his gaze, neither of them speaking for a long moment. "Tell me about your cabin," she said finally, breaking the silence. Zachary described the small but sturdy structure he had built 3 years ago as a refuge between bounty hunting jobs. "It's nothing fancy," he admitted. "One room with a fireplace, a bed, a table and chairs. But it's solid, keeps the weather out." "It sounds peaceful," Bethany said wistfully. "I've never lived anywhere so remote. It can be lonely," Zachary acknowledged, "but there's a beauty to the silence. At night, you can hear the wolves howling in the distance, and in the morning, deer often graze just outside the door." Bethany smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "You sound like you love it there." "I do," he admitted. "It's the only place I feel truly at peace." "And you're willing to share it with a stranger?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Zachary considered his answer carefully. "You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Bethany. Not after what we've been through," she nodded, accepting this. "Thank you for everything." That night, Zachary insisted on sleeping in the chair again, despite Bethany's protests that he should take the bed while she rested on the small settee in the corner. "I've slept in worse places," he assured her. "Besides, I'm a light sleeper. If anyone comes looking for you, I'll hear them." As the lamp burned low, casting shadows across the room, Bethany's voice came soft from the bed. "Zach, what if Sullivan finds me before you find him?" In the dimness, Zachary met her gaze, his expression resolute. "He won't, I promise you that." "How can you be so sure?" she whispered. "Because I never break a promise," he replied simply. "Now get some sleep. We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." As Bethany's breathing deepened into sleep, Zachary kept his vigil, watching her face relaxed in slumber. An unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest, a fierce protectiveness that went beyond professional duty. It unsettled him, this sudden connection to a woman he barely knew. Tomorrow they would ride to his sanctuary in the mountains, and then he would hunt down Sullivan and his gang. But tonight, in the quiet room with only the sound of Bethany's breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling, Zachary Irving admitted to himself that his world had irrevocably changed the moment he cut those ropes and carried Bethany Winters to safety. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Aurora, the fresh snowfall glittering in the early light. Zachary had risen before sunrise, arranging for supplies and a horse for Bethany. Mrs. Holbrook had packed them food for the journey and extra blankets, refusing payment with a firm shake of her head. "You just bring that girl back safe when this is all over," she told Zachary as she handed him the provisions. "She's good for this town, even if some folks don't see it." Bethany emerged from her room dressed in clothes borrowed from Mrs. Holbrook's daughter, a sturdy woolen dress, thick stockings, and a heavy coat. Mrs. Holbrook had also provided a pair of men's trousers to wear under the dress for the ride, practical concession to the bitter cold they would face. "Are you sure you're strong enough for this journey?" Zachary asked as he helped her mount the chestnut mare he'd procured. Bethany adjusted her position in the saddle, grimacing slightly at the soreness in her limbs. "I'll manage. I'm stronger than I look." Zachary smiled up at her. I'm beginning to see that. They set out as the town was just beginning to stir, taking the northern road out of Aurora before veering west toward the mountains. Zachary kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, wary of any sign they were being followed. Bethany rode beside him in silence, her face partially hidden by the woolen scarf wrapped around her neck and lower face. As the sun climbed higher, Zachary led them off the main trail onto a narrow path that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The going was slower here, the horses picking their way carefully through the snow-covered terrain. "How much farther?" Bethany asked during a brief stop to rest the horses. "We should reach the cabin by nightfall," Zachary replied, checking the cinches on his saddle. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she insisted, though the pallor of her face told a different story. Zachary stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Bethany, there's no shame in admitting you're struggling. What you went through, most people wouldn't even be able to ride today." Her blue eyes met his, a flash of vulnerability showing through her composed exterior. "I can't afford to be weak right now, Zach. I just can't," he nodded, understanding. "We'll take it slow. Tell me if you need to stop." As they continued their journey, Zachary began to point out landmarks and wildlife tracks to distract Bethany from her discomfort. She proved to be a quick study, soon identifying rabbit and fox prints on her own. By midday, some color had returned to her cheeks, and she seemed more at ease in the saddle. "You mentioned you came west to teach," Zachary said as they followed a stream through a shallow valley. "What made you leave St. Louis?" Bethany was quiet for a moment before answering. "After my father died last year, there was nothing keeping me there. My mother passed when I was 16 and my brothers had all moved away." She adjusted her gloves. "I saw an advertisement for a teacher in Aurora and thought, well, I thought it would be an adventure, a fresh start." "And was it?" "Before all this happened, I mean." A small smile touched her lips. "It was. The children are wonderful, eager to learn, even the ones who pretend not to be. And there's something about the mountains, the vastness of the sky out here. It makes a person feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time." Zachary nodded, surprised by the poetry in her words. "I know exactly what you mean." "What about you?" she asked. "How does someone become a bounty hunter?" Zachary's expression darkened slightly. "That's a longer story, not necessarily a pleasant one." "We have time," Bethany pointed out, gesturing to the trail ahead. Zachary was quiet for so long that Bethany thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I was a Union soldier during the war. Afterwards, I tried settling down, ranching in Kansas. Had a wife, a baby on the way." He paused, his jaw tightening. "A gang of former Confederates who turned outlaw raided our homestead while I was in town. By the time I got back, the house was burned to the ground. My wife, Margaret, was dead." "Oh, Zach," Bethany breathed. "I'm so sorry." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "I tracked those men for 8 months. When I finally caught up to them, I turned them in for the bounty instead of killing them like I'd planned. Realized that justice served the law's way helped me more than vengeance would have." He shrugged. "Found I had a talent for tracking, for bringing in wanted men. Been doing it ever since." "How long ago was that?" Bethany asked gently. 7 years this spring," he replied. "Sometimes feels like yesterday, sometimes like another lifetime." They rode in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. As the afternoon wore on, the trail began to climb more steeply into the foothills. Bethany was visibly tiring, though she made no complaint. "Not much farther now," Zachary assured her, pointing to a ridge ahead. "The cabin is just beyond that rise." The sun was setting when they finally crested the ridge, casting long shadows across the small clearing where Zachary's cabin stood. It was just as he had described, a simple, sturdy structure built of logs with a stone chimney. A small corral stood off to one side, and a woodpile was stacked neatly against the side of the cabin. "It's lovely," Bethany said sincerely as Zachary helped her dismount. Her legs nearly buckled as they hit the ground, and he caught her around the waist, steadying her. "Easy," he murmured, his face close to hers. "You've pushed yourself too hard today." "Worth it," she replied with a tired smile. "We made it." Zachary quickly got a fire going in the fireplace while Bethany sank gratefully into a chair at the small table. The cabin was simple but clean, with a neatly made bed against one wall, shelves holding books and supplies, and a bearskin rug on the plank floor. "I need to tend to the horses," Zachary said, pulling his gloves back on. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Bethany nodded, already feeling the warmth of the fire reaching her. "I'll be fine." When Zachary returned, he found Bethany had dozed off in the chair, her head resting on her folded arms at the table. Rather than wake her, he gently lifted her and carried her to the bed, removing only her boots before covering her with a quilt. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, exhaustion having claimed her completely. Zachary prepared a simple supper of beans and bacon, setting aside a portion for Bethany when she woke. As night deepened outside, he sat in the chair by the fire, cleaning his revolver and planning his hunt for Sullivan. He would leave at first light, following their trail back toward Aurora before picking up the Blackwater gang's tracks. Bethany woke disoriented, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings until memory returned. The cabin was dark except for the glow of embers in the fireplace, where Zachary slept sitting upright in a chair, his revolver across his lap. She watched him for a moment in the dim light, studying the strong lines of his face relaxed in sleep. There was a gentleness to him that belied his dangerous profession, a kindness that showed in the small things, the way he'd looked after her, taught her about animal tracks, shared his painful past. As if sensing her gaze, Zachary's eyes opened, immediately alert. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice husky with sleep. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm sorry I took your bed." He waved away her concern. "You needed it more than I did." He stirred the embers and added another log to the fire, bringing the flames back to life. "Are you hungry? There's food." Bethany realized she was, in fact, starving. They ate together at the small table, Zachary explaining his plan to leave in the morning. "I've stocked enough supplies to last you at least a month," he told her, "though I hope to be back much sooner than that." "There's a rifle on the rack by the door. Do you know how to use one?" Bethany nodded. "My father taught all his children, even his daughters, though it's been some time since I've practiced." "I'll show you where everything is before I go," Zachary continued. "The cabin is well hidden and I don't expect trouble, but it's best to be prepared." "How will you find Sullivan?" Bethany asked, pushing her empty plate away. "I'll start by backtracking to Aurora, pick up their trail from there." From what the sheriff said, they headed east, probably toward the Kansas border. Zachary's expression hardened. "They won't be expecting me to be so close behind them. They think they've scared you into silence and have all the time in the world." "Be careful," Bethany said quietly. "Sullivan is dangerous. I saw the look in his eyes when he—" She swallowed hard, remembering the cold calculation in the outlaw's face as he ordered his men to tie her to the post. Zachary reached across the table, briefly touching her hand. "I've dealt with men like Sullivan before." "This is what I do, Bethany." She nodded, withdrawing her hand after a moment. "I know, I wouldn't want anyone else to get hurt because of me." "No one will," he assured her. "Now you should get some more rest. Tomorrow I'll show you around the place before I leave." Bethany hesitated. "I can't keep taking your bed, Zach." "Yes, you can," he said firmly. "I've slept in that chair plenty of times." Too exhausted to argue further, Bethany returned to the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her again was Zachary's silhouette against the firelight, his steady presence a comfort in the wilderness. Morning came too quickly. After a breakfast of flapjacks and coffee, Zachary took Bethany on a tour of the cabin and its surroundings, showing her where he kept supplies, how to operate the pump for water, and where the best fishing spots were along the nearby stream. "If you need to leave for any reason," he said as they stood outside the cabin, "there's a trail behind the woodpile that leads to a neighbor's homestead about 5 miles east. The Petersons are good people, you can trust them." Bethany nodded, taking in all the information. She was dressed in the same borrowed clothes, her hair braided neatly down her back. In the clear morning light, with color back in her cheeks, she looked stronger, more like the capable schoolteacher she was than the half-frozen victim he'd found tied to a post. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" she asked as Zachary saddled his horse. "A week, maybe 2, he replied. "Depends on how far they've gone and how easy their trail is to follow." He secured his bedroll behind the saddle and checked his saddlebags. "If I'm not back in 3 weeks, go to the Petersons. They'll help you get to safety." The reality of their parting suddenly hit Bethany, and she felt a surprising wave of emotion. This man, this virtual stranger, had saved her life, offered her protection, and was now riding into danger on her behalf. She stepped forward impulsively and placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said earnestly, "for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Zachary covered her hand with his own. "Stay safe. That's repayment enough." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Zachary cleared his throat and mounted his horse, settling into the saddle. "Remember, keep the doors barred at night and don't wander too far from the cabin," he instructed. "There's paper and pencils in the drawer if you want to write. I know time will pass slowly." Bethany nodded, stepping back. "Good luck, Zach. Come back safely." With a tip of his hat and a final look that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary, Zachary turned his horse and rode away, following the trail back the way they had come. Bethany watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned to face the cabin, her sanctuary and prison for the foreseeable future. The first few days passed slowly as Bethany adjusted to the solitude. She kept herself busy cleaning the already tidy cabin, organizing Zachary's books, and exploring the immediate surroundings. She discovered a small journal in one of the drawers and began recording her thoughts and experiences, finding comfort in putting words to paper. On the 4th day, a snowstorm blew in, forcing her to remain indoors. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters, but the sturdy walls held firm against the onslaught. Wrapped in a quilt by the fire, Bethany found herself wondering where Zachary was, if he was caught in the same storm, if he was safe. It surprised her how quickly he had come to occupy her thoughts. She barely knew him, yet she felt connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was simply gratitude for his rescue, or the intimate circumstances of their brief acquaintance. Whatever it was, she found herself watching the trail for his return, even though she knew it was far too soon. Meanwhile, Zachary had picked up the Blackwater gang's trail just outside Aurora. They had indeed headed east, but their tracks showed they were traveling slowly, stopping frequently in small towns along the way. By the 3rd day, Zachary had gained considerable ground on them, and by the 4th, he caught sight of their campfire from a distant ridge. 5 men sat around the fire, passing a bottle between them. Zachary recognized Sullivan immediately, a tall man with a distinctive red beard and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jawline. The others were familiar faces from wanted posters. James "Squint" Miller, the Dawson brothers, and a younger man Zachary didn't recognize. Zachary observed them through his field glass, noting their positions and weapons. Taking on 5 men alone would be risky, but he'd faced worse odds. He would wait until they were asleep, then move in. The snowstorm hit just as darkness fell, forcing Zachary to delay his plan. Huddled in a shallow cave a half-mile from the outlaws' camp, he thought of Bethany alone in his cabin. He hoped she was staying warm, that she wasn't too frightened by the storm. The concern surprised him. He wasn't usually one to worry about others once he was on the hunt, but Bethany Winters was different. Her courage in the face of what she'd endured, her quiet dignity, her unexpected moments of humor all had made an impression on him that he couldn't easily dismiss. For the first time in years, Zachary found himself thinking about what might come after this job was done. The storm raged for 2 days, during which the Blackwater gang remained holed up in an abandoned line shack. Zachary maintained his surveillance, waiting for the right moment to strike. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the storm finally abated, he saw his opportunity. 2 of the men, Squint Miller and one of the Dawson brothers, left the shack, presumably to check on the horses or hunt for food. That left Sullivan, the other Dawson, and the unknown young man in the shack. Better odds, though still dangerous. Zachary circled around through the trees, approaching the line shack from the rear. He could hear voices inside Sullivan complaining about the delay, someone else responding in tones too low to make out. Moving silently despite the fresh snow, Zachary positioned himself beside the single window at the back of the shack. A quick glance inside confirmed his count. Sullivan was cleaning his revolver at a rough table, Dawson was lying on a cot, and the young man was stoking a meager fire in the small stove. None were looking in his direction. Zachary drew his revolver, took a deep breath, and kicked in the door. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "Hands where I can see them." Sullivan's reaction was instant. He reached for his disassembled gun. Zachary fired once, the bullet striking the table inches from Sullivan's hand. "Next one won't miss," Zachary warned. "Hands up, all of you." The younger man immediately raised his hands, fear evident on his face. Dawson was slower to comply, but eventually raised his hands as well. Sullivan, however, glared at Zachary with pure hatred. "Irving," he spat. "Should have known you'd be on our trail." "You're under arrest, Sullivan," Zachary replied evenly. "For bank robbery, attempted murder, and whatever else the judge decides to add." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "This about that school teacher. She didn't see nothing. Then why'd you leave her to freeze to death?" Zachary demanded, keeping his revolver steady. A cruel smile spread across Sullivan's face. "Just to be sure. Shame you found her. She was a pretty little thing." Zachary's finger tightened on the trigger, but he maintained his composure. "On your feet, nice and slow. You're going back to Denver to stand trial." What happened next unfolded in seconds. The door behind Zachary burst open as Miller and the other Dawson returned. Distracted by the noise, Zachary turned slightly enough for Sullivan to lunge for his gun. Shots rang out in the confined space of the shack, the sound deafening. Zachary felt a bullet graze his left arm but managed to fire twice, dropping Miller where he stood. The younger man had thrown himself to the floor, hands over his head. Sullivan fired again, missing Zachary by inches. Zachary returned fire, his bullet finding its mark in Sullivan's shoulder, spinning the outlaw around. The Dawson brothers fired simultaneously. Zachary dove behind an overturned table, feeling splinters fly as bullets tore through the wood. He rolled to the side, came up on one knee, and fired methodically one shot for each Dawson, both finding their targets. When the gun smoke cleared, Miller and one of the Dawsons lay dead. The other Dawson was wounded but alive, as was Sullivan, who clutched his bleeding shoulder and cursed vividly. The young man remained on the floor, unharmed and terrified. Zachary's arm burned where the bullet had grazed him, but the wound was superficial. He quickly disarmed the surviving outlaws and used their own belts to bind their hands. "You're making a mistake, Irving," Sullivan growled as Zachary tightened the makeshift restraint. "I've got friends who won't take kindly to this." "Save it for the judge," Zachary replied coldly. He turned to the young man who couldn't have been more than 20. "What's your name, boy?" "T. Tommy Walsh," the young man stammered. I just joined up with them a month ago. I didn't know about any of this, I swear. Zachary studied him for a moment. Did you participate in the Denver bank robbery? Tommy shook his head vehemently. No, sir, I wasn't with them then. I just met up with them after in Pueblo. He's lying, Sullivan snarled. He was there. Tommy's face paled. No, I wasn't, Mr. Irving. I swear on my mother's grave. Shut up, both of you, Zachary ordered. He wasn't sure if the young man was telling the truth, but that was for a court to decide. I'm taking all of you in, the living and the dead. It took Zachary the better part of the day to secure his prisoners, tend to their wounds enough to keep them alive, and load the dead onto their horses. By nightfall, they were heading west toward Denver, where the federal marshal had an office. The journey would take several days, especially with wounded prisoners, but Zachary was determined to see justice done. As they made camp that first night, Sullivan watched Zachary with calculating eyes. That school teacher, he said quietly, so the others couldn't hear. Where'd you take her? Zachary ignored him, continuing to secure the camp. She's a liability, Irving, Sullivan continued. Even if she didn't see our faces, she can place us in Denver that day. My friends will find her, with or without me. Your friends will be too busy running from the law themselves once I turn you in, Zachary replied evenly. Sullivan chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. You think this is the whole gang. There are more of us than you know. And they won't stop looking for her. Zachary knelt beside Sullivan, his voice low and dangerous. If anything happens to her, I will personally hunt down every last one of your associates, and I won't be bringing them in alive. The threat hung in the air between them, Sullivan's eyes widening slightly at the cold certainty in Zachary's voice. For the first time, the outlaw seemed to realize he might have underestimated this bounty hunter. Get some sleep, Zachary said, rising to his feet. We've got a long ride ahead of us. As Sullivan settled uncomfortably against a tree, his wounded shoulder making sleep unlikely, Zachary moved away to check on the other prisoners. His thoughts turned to Bethany, alone in his cabin. Sullivan's words had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. If there were others in the Blackwater gang, others who might still pose a threat to Bethany, he needed to deliver these men to justice and get back to the cabin as quickly as possible. The sooner Bethany was truly safe, the better. Back at the cabin, Bethany had settled into a routine of sorts. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched snow that glittered in the sunlight. Each morning, she checked the trail for any sign of Zachary's return, though she knew it was too soon to expect him. On the 10th day of his absence, Bethany was gathering firewood near the edge of the clearing, when she heard a sound that made her freeze, the distant but unmistakable clop of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart raced as she dropped the armful of wood and hurried back to the cabin, grabbing the rifle Zachary had shown her how to use. Peering cautiously through the window, she waited, the rifle ready in her trembling hands. A lone rider appeared at the edge of the clearing, a stranger, not Zachary. The man was heavyset, with a bushy beard and a weathered face. He rode directly to the cabin and dismounted, approaching the door with confident strides. "Hello there," he called out. "Anybody home?" Bethany remained silent, her finger hovering near the trigger. "I know someone's here," the man continued. "Saw smoke from your chimney. I'm a friend of Zach Irving's. Name's Peterson. My place is a few miles east." Bethany remembered Zachary mentioning the Petersons. Still cautious, she called through the door. "What do you want?" "Just checking in," Peterson replied. "Zach asked me to keep an eye on his place while he was gone, and I noticed someone was staying here. Figured it might be a friend of his." Bethany hesitated, then unbarred the door, though she kept the rifle visible. "I'm Bethany Winters. Zach is helping me with a situation." Peterson nodded, seeming unsurprised by her caution. "That sounds like Zach, always helping folks in trouble." He removed his hat. "My wife sent some stew and fresh bread. Thought you might appreciate a hot meal you didn't have to cook yourself." The gesture was so unexpected and kind that Bethany felt tears spring to her eyes. She lowered the rifle and opened the door wider. "That's very thoughtful. Would you like to come in?" Peterson shook his head. "Can't stay. Got chores waiting, but the missus would love it if you'd visit sometime. Gets lonely for female company, especially in winter." "I'd like that," Bethany said sincerely. "Though Zach asked me to stay close to the cabin until he returns." "Smart man," Peterson agreed. He retrieved a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Here's the food." "Oh, and there's news from town. Marshall caught some of the Blackwater gang trying to rob the bank in Denver. Shot 2 of them dead, captured 3 others." Bethany's heart leapt. Was Zach there? Was he involved? Peterson shook his head. "Don't know the details. Just heard it from a passing rider yesterday." He settled his hat back on his head. "Well, I should get going. You need anything, our place is just down that east trail. Can't miss it, got a windmill that squeaks something awful." After Peterson left, Bethany sat at the table, her mind racing. Had Zachary been the one to capture the gang members? Was he on his way back? Or was he still tracking Sullivan and the others? The uncertainty was maddening. She ate the delicious stew Mrs. Peterson had sent, grateful for the taste of home cooking and the brief human contact. As darkness fell, she stoked the fire and settled in with one of Zachary's books, though her mind kept wandering from the pages. That night, her dreams were troubled visions of Zachary wounded, of Sullivan finding the cabin, of being tied to that post again as the cold seeped into her bones. She woke with a start just before dawn, her heart pounding. Unable to return to sleep, she rose and began her day, trying to occupy her mind with chores and reading. By the 14th day of Zachary's absence, Bethany had worn a path in the snow between the cabin and the ridge where she could look down the trail. Each day, she stood there for longer periods, searching for any sign of his return. The isolation was beginning to wear on her, the constant vigilance exhausting. She had just returned from one such vigil when she heard the distant sound of a horse approaching. Grabbing the rifle, she positioned herself by the window, ready for whoever might appear. When Zachary's familiar figure emerged from the trees, Bethany felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. She set the rifle aside and ran out into the clearing, heedless of the cold or propriety. Zachary dismounted stiffly, his face drawn with fatigue. He looked up just in time to see Bethany hurrying toward him, her face alight with welcome. Something in his expression shifted, softened at the sight of her. "You're back," Bethany said, stopping a few feet from him, suddenly aware of her impulsive reaction. "I am," he replied, a small smile touching his lips. "And you're still here." "Did you expect me to leave?" she asked, gesturing toward the cabin. "No," he admitted, "but I'm glad to see you all the same." She noticed then that his left arm was bandaged, a dark stain visible through the fabric. "You're hurt." Zachary glanced at his arm dismissively. "It's nothing, barely a scratch." "Mr. Peterson came by," Bethany said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the cabin. "He said some of the Blackwater gang were caught in Denver." "News travels fast," Zachary remarked. He led his horse to the small corral, beginning to unsaddle it. Bethany noticed he favored his left arm, despite his claims that the wound was minor. "Was it you?" she pressed. "Did you catch them?" Zachary nodded, lifting the saddle off with a slight grimace. "Sullivan, one of the Dawson brothers, and a young fellow named Walsh. 2 others didn't survive the encounter. Sullivan is in custody." Bethany's voice quavered slightly, the relief almost overwhelming. "He is, along with most of his gang." Zachary turned to face her, his expression serious. "But there may be others, Bethany. Associates of his who weren't with him when I made the capture." The brief flare of hope dimmed in Bethany's eyes. "So I'm still in danger." "Potentially," Zachary acknowledged, "but Sullivan will stand trial in Denver next month." Once he's convicted, and he will be, between the bank robbery and what he did to you, his friends will have less reason to come after you. Next month, Bethany repeated, her shoulders slumping slightly. So I stay hidden until then. Zachary finished tending to his horse and led the way back to the cabin. That would be safest, but you don't have to stay here alone. I'll be with you. The simple statement sent an unexpected warmth through Bethany. She watched as Zachary entered the cabin, noting how at home he looked in the simple space. He removed his coat and hat, hanging them by the door, then checked the fire, adding a log to the smoldering embers. "You've kept the place tidy," he commented, glancing around. "It gave me something to do," Bethany replied. She hesitated, then added, "I organized your books. I hope you don't mind." Zachary smiled, the expression transforming his tired face. "Not at all. Did you find anything worth reading?" "Several things," she said, returning his smile. "I didn't expect a bounty hunter to have such a collection of literature." "My mother was a schoolteacher," he explained, sinking into a chair with a sigh of relief. "She believed in the power of books to transport us beyond our circumstances." Bethany began preparing a meal, using some of the provisions Mrs. Peterson had sent. As she worked, she asked Zachary about his journey, about the capture of Sullivan and his men. He told her the story in measured tones, downplaying the danger he had faced. "Your arm needs tending," Bethany said when he finished his account. "Let me see it." Zachary started to protest, but relented when she fixed him with a stern look that reminded him of her profession as a teacher. He carefully removed his shirt, revealing the bandage wrapped around his upper arm. Beneath it, an angry red furrow marked where the bullet had grazed him. "This needs to be properly cleaned," Bethany said, examining the wound. "It's starting to look infected." She set about preparing hot water and finding clean bandages, her movements efficient and purposeful. Zachary watched her, noting how different she was from the half-frozen woman he had found tied to a post. Here, in his cabin, she moved with confidence, her earlier fear replaced by determination. "You're quite capable, Miss Winters," he observed as she began cleaning his wound. "I've had practice," she replied, concentrating on her task. Teaching school in a small town means dealing with all manner of injuries. Boys are particularly prone to mishaps. Zachary winced as she applied a salve to the wound. "I can believe that. I was probably a nightmare for my teachers." Bethany glanced up, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I would have managed you." Their gazes held for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Zachary cleared his throat and looked away first. "I have no doubt," he murmured. Once his arm was properly bandaged, they shared the meal Bethany had prepared. The simple act of eating together in the warm cabin created an unexpected intimacy, a sense of domesticity that neither had experienced in some time. "What happens after Sullivan's trial?" Bethany asked as they finished eating. "Will it be safe for me to return to Aurora?" Zachary considered her question. "That depends on how many of his associates are still free. The trial will bring attention to his crimes, make it harder for anyone connected to him to operate openly." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But returning to Aurora might not be wise, regardless. The town allowed you to be tied to that post, Bethany. No one came to help you." The brutal truth of his statement hung in the air between them. Bethany's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about that these past 2 weeks, about how people I thought I knew, parents of my students, shopkeepers who greeted me every day, they must have seen what was happening, and they did nothing." "Fear is a powerful motivator for inaction," Zachary said. "Sullivan had friends in town. People were afraid to cross him." "That doesn't make it right," Bethany replied, a flash of anger in her eyes. "No," Zachary agreed. "It doesn't." They fell silent for a moment, the fire crackling in the hearth the only sound. "I could go back to St. Louis," Bethany said finally, "or find a teaching position in another town far from here." The thought of Bethany leaving, of never seeing her again, caused an unexpected pang in Zachary's chest. These past 2 weeks, knowing she was in his cabin, had changed something in him. The solitary existence he had maintained since Margaret's death no longer held the same appeal. "You could," he acknowledged. "Or you could stay." Bethany looked at him in surprise. "Stay here, not necessarily in this cabin," Zachary clarified, suddenly feeling awkward, "but in this area. The settlement where the Petersons' live is growing. They might need a teacher soon." "Are you suggesting I hide away in the mountains forever?" Bethany asked, her tone unreadable. Zachary ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to express what he was feeling. "I'm suggesting that you consider all your options before making a decision." Bethany studied him for a long moment. "And what would you prefer, Zach? What option would you choose for me if the choice were yours?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her across the table, at her intelligent eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive both Sullivan's cruelty and 2 weeks alone in the wilderness, and knew he couldn't lie to her. "I prefer you stayed," he admitted quietly. "Somewhere I could. Look out for you, make sure you were safe." A smile touched Bethany's lips. "Is that the only reason? My safety?" Zachary held her gaze, his heart hammering in his chest. "No," he said simply. "That's not the only reason." The admission hung between them, changing the atmosphere in the small cabin. Bethany's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to stay, at least until I know for certain that Sullivan and his friends can no longer hurt me." She paused, then added softly, "and perhaps beyond that, depending on circumstances." Zachary nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning behind her words. They were both cautious people, wary of rushing into declarations or promises that might not be kept. But something had begun between them, something neither had expected but both now acknowledged. "I should get some rest," Zachary said, rising from the table. "It's been a long journey." "Take the bed," Bethany insisted. "You're injured and exhausted. I'll sleep in the chair." "I won't hear of it," Zachary replied firmly. "I've slept in that chair many times. It suits me fine." In the end, they compromised. Zachary took the bed for the night, while Bethany made herself comfortable in the chair by the fire. As darkness settled over the cabin and the fire burned low, they bid each other good night, each aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. In the quiet hours before dawn, Bethany woke to the sound of Zachary moving restlessly in the bed, murmuring in his sleep. She rose and went to him, placing a gentle hand on his forehead. He was warm, too warm, his skin flushed and damp with sweat. "Zach," she called softly, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then clearing as they settled on her face. "Bethany, what's wrong?" "You have a fever," she told him. "Your arm, the wound must be infected despite our efforts." Zachary tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. "Damn," he muttered. "Thought it was healing fine." Bethany lit a lamp and examined his bandaged arm. When she unwrapped it, she found the skin around the wound angry and swollen, hot to the touch. "This needs medicine," she said, her concern evident. "Do you have any in the cabin?" "Cupboard above the wash basin," Zachary directed, his voice strained. "There's a bottle of whiskey and some willow bark." Bethany found the items and set about making a poultice for the wound. She helped Zachary drink water mixed with willow bark for the fever, then had him take a swallow of whiskey for the pain, before pouring some over the wound to clean it. He hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. "Sorry," she murmured, working as gently as she could. "This needs to be cleaned thoroughly." For the rest of the night, Bethany tended to Zachary, replacing the poultice when it grew warm, helping him drink water and cooling his forehead with damp cloths. By morning, his fever had broken and he slept more peacefully. Bethany watched him sleep, her own exhaustion forgotten in her concern for him. It struck her as ironic that their roles had reversed so completely. Now she was the one caring for him, keeping him safe. As the sun rose, Zachary opened his eyes, finding Bethany dozing in a chair pulled close to the bed, her hand still resting on his arm. He studied her face, soft in sleep, and felt a surge of emotion that both surprised and frightened him. 7 years, he had wandered alone, avoiding connections, avoiding anything that might lead to the kind of devastating loss he had experienced with Margaret. Yet here he was, allowing himself to care for this woman he barely knew, this brave schoolteacher who had somehow slipped past his defenses. Bethany stirred, her eyes opening to find Zachary watching her. "How do you feel?" she asked, immediately alert. "Better," he replied, his voice rough with sleep. "Thanks to you." She touched his forehead. "Your fever's gone. How's the arm?" "Sore, but not as bad as last night." He attempted to sit up and this time succeeded with Bethany's help. "You need to rest," she admonished. "That infection could come back if you push yourself too hard." Zachary nodded, surprisingly agreeable. "Yes, madam." Bethany busied herself making breakfast, aware of Zachary's eyes following her around the cabin. When she brought him a plate of food, he caught her hand before she could move away. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, "for taking care of me." She smiled softly. "You did the same for me." "That was different," he protested. "You were in danger, freezing to death. And you were burning up with fever," she countered. "Seems fair to me." He didn't release her hand, instead running his thumb over her knuckles. "Bethany," he began, then hesitated. "Yes." She prompted, her heart beating faster at the look in his eyes. Before he could continue, a sound outside the cabin caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Zachary immediately tensed, reaching for his revolver on the bedside table. "Are you expecting anyone?" Bethany asked, moving away from the bed. "No," Zachary replied, swinging his legs over the side of the bed despite the pain in his arm. "Get the rifle and stay back from the windows." Bethany did as she was told, positioning herself in the corner of the cabin with the rifle ready. Zachary pulled on his shirt, ignoring the protest from his injured arm, and moved to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the shutters. "It's Peterson," he said with relief, lowering his revolver. "And someone else with him." Bethany set the rifle aside as Zachary opened the door. Peterson dismounted quickly, his expression grave. The man with him was younger, wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal. "Irving," Peterson greeted. "This is Marshal Daniels. He's been looking for you." "Mr. Irving," the marshal said with a nod. "And I presume this is Miss Winters." "It is," Zachary confirmed, his body still positioned protectively between the visitors and Bethany. "What's this about, Marshal?" "I'm afraid I have news," Daniels said grimly. "Reginald Sullivan escaped custody yesterday while being transported to Denver for trial. He killed 2 deputies in the process." Bethany gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Zachary's expression hardened. "How?" he demanded. "Friends of his ambushed the transport wagon," the marshal explained. "They were waiting in a narrow pass about 30 miles east of here. Professional job, they knew exactly when and where to hit. And now Sullivan is free," Zachary concluded, his voice cold. "Yes," the marshal confirmed. "And word is he's looking for both of you, particularly Miss Winters." Zachary turned to Bethany, who had gone pale but remained composed. "We need to leave," he said. "This place isn't safe anymore." "Where can we go?" she asked, already moving to gather her few belongings. "I have a suggestion," Marshal Daniels said. "We're organizing a posse to track Sullivan. Mr. Irving, your skills would be invaluable. Meanwhile, Miss Winters could stay at the territorial governor's residence in Denver. She'd be well protected there until Sullivan is recaptured." Zachary shook his head. "I'm not leaving Bethany." "Zach," Bethany said softly, touching his arm, "if you can help catch Sullivan, you should go." "I'll be safe in Denver." "She's right," Peterson added. "My Ruth and I can escort her to Denver ourselves. The governor's wife is Ruth's cousin. She'll make sure Miss Winters is treated like family." Zachary looked torn, his desire to protect Bethany warring with the knowledge that he was uniquely qualified to track Sullivan. "Sullivan won't stop until he's caught," the marshal pointed out. "The best way to ensure Miss Winters' safety is to recapture him as quickly as possible." "He's right," Bethany said, her voice stronger now. "I'll be fine, Zach. Go do what you do best." Zachary studied her face, seeing the determination there. "You're sure?" she nodded. "I'm sure. Catch him, Zach. End this so we can both stop looking over our shoulders." The decision made, they moved quickly. Bethany packed her few belongings while Zachary gathered his tracking gear, his arm protesting but functional. Within an hour, they were ready to depart. Bethany with the Petersons to Denver, Zachary with Marshal Daniels to join the posse. As they stood outside the cabin, preparing to part ways, Zachary pulled Bethany aside. "Be careful," he said, his eyes intense. "Don't trust anyone you don't know, even in the governor's house." "I will," she promised. "And you do the same. Don't let your injury slow you down." He smiled slightly. "I wouldn't dare, knowing you'd scold me for it." Bethany returned his smile, though her eyes were serious. "Come back safely, Zach. I'll be waiting." The simple declaration held more meaning than either of them could express in words. Zachary reached out, touching her cheek gently. "I'll find you in Denver," he promised. "When this is over." With that, they parted, Bethany riding alongside the Petersons toward Denver, Zachary and Marshal Daniels heading east to intercept the posse already forming to hunt Sullivan. As the distance between them grew, Bethany looked back once, seeing Zachary still watching her. She raised her hand in farewell, a gesture he returned before turning his horse and riding away. The journey to Denver was tense but uneventful. Mrs. Peterson proved to be excellent company, her cheerful chatter helping to distract Bethany from her worries. True to Peterson's word, they were warmly welcomed at the governor's residence, where Mrs. Harrington, the governor's wife, embraced Bethany like a long-lost relative. "You poor dear," she exclaimed, leading Bethany to a comfortable bedroom far grander than anything she had ever stayed in. "Ruth has told me everything. You're safe now, I promise you that." The governor's residence was a fortress of sorts, with armed guards and high walls. For the first time since Sullivan had dragged her from her boarding house, Bethany felt truly secure. Yet her thoughts constantly returned to Zachary, out in the wilderness hunting a dangerous killer who wanted them both dead. Meanwhile, Zachary and Marshal Daniels had joined a posse of 10 men, a mix of lawmen and experienced trackers. Sullivan's trail led them south toward the New Mexico territory, suggesting he was making a run for the border. "He's moving fast," one of the trackers observed on their second day of pursuit, pushing his horse hard. "He knows we're after him," Zachary replied, studying the tracks. "But he's making mistakes. See here. He's not covering his trail as carefully as he should." The posse pushed on, gaining ground each day. Zachary's arm had begun to heal properly, the infection cleared by Bethany's careful treatment. At night, as the other men shared stories around the campfire, Zachary kept to himself, thinking of Bethany in Denver, wondering if she was safe, if she was thinking of him too. On the 5th day of the pursuit, they caught a break. A station master at a remote way station reported seeing Sullivan just hours earlier, heading west now rather than south. "West," Marshal Daniels frowned. "Why would he change direction when he was so close to the border?" Zachary's blood ran cold as realization struck. "He's going to Denver. He's after Bethany." "That's impossible," one of the deputies argued. "He can't know she's in Denver, and even if he did, he'd never get near the governor's residence." "We can't take that chance," Zachary insisted, already mounting his horse. "We need to split up, some continue following his trail, the rest ride for Denver immediately." Marshal Daniels saw the determination in Zachary's eyes and nodded. "All right. Irving, take 3 men and head for Denver. The rest of us will stay on Sullivan's trail in case this is a false alarm." Zachary chose the men with the freshest horses, and they set off at a punishing pace. The 4-day ride to Denver became a desperate 2-day journey, the men switching to fresh horses at way stations and riding through the night. As they approached Denver, Zachary's anxiety grew. Had Sullivan somehow learned where Bethany was staying? Was she still safe behind the governor's walls? He pushed his horse harder, ignoring the pain in his arm and the exhaustion seeping into his bones. At the governor's residence, Bethany had settled into a comfortable routine. Mrs. Harrington had introduced her to Denver society as a distant relative visiting from the East, and Bethany played the part well, grateful for the anonymity it provided. She spent her days reading in the governor's extensive library, writing in her journal, and occasionally accompanying Mrs. Harrington on social calls. A week after her arrival, the governor hosted a dinner party for several territorial officials and their wives. Bethany attended reluctantly, preferring to keep a low profile, but Mrs. Harrington had insisted. "You can't hide away forever, my dear," she said as her maid helped Bethany dress in a borrowed gown of deep blue silk. "Besides, it will do you good to have some diversion." The dinner was more enjoyable than Bethany had anticipated. The conversations were stimulating, the food excellent, and for a few hours, she almost forgot the danger that had brought her to Denver. As the evening wound down, one of the late-arriving guests caught Bethany's attention, a distinguished-looking man with silver at his temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He was introduced as Judge Wilson, recently arrived from Cheyenne. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though Bethany couldn't place where she might have seen him before. The judge engaged her in conversation, asking polite questions about her background. Bethany maintained her cover story, claiming to be from Philadelphia rather than St. Louis. The judge seemed particularly interested in how long she planned to stay in Denver. "I'm not certain," Bethany replied carefully. "It depends on family matters." "Of course," the judge said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Denver can be quite captivating. I myself have only just arrived but find it most intriguing." As the judge excused himself to speak with the governor, Bethany watched him go, a sense of unease settling over her. Something about his manner, the intensity of his gaze, had set off warning bells in her mind. That night, unable to sleep, Bethany sat by her bedroom window looking out at the moonlit garden below. Her thoughts, as always, turned to Zachary. Had he caught Sullivan yet? Was he safe? When would he return to her? A movement in the garden caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beneath a tree. Bethany leaned forward, straining to see more clearly. A man was crossing the garden stealthily, heading toward the house. As he passed through a patch of moonlight, Bethany caught a glimpse of his face and froze in terror. It was Judge Wilson, except he wasn't a judge at all. Beneath the false beard and different clothing, she recognized the cruel eyes and distinctive features of Reginald Sullivan. Bethany's heart pounded as she backed away from the window. Sullivan had infiltrated the governor's dinner party, had spoken with her directly, had learned exactly where in the house she was staying. And now he was coming for her. She grabbed her robe and slippers, her mind racing. She needed to alert the guards, warn the household. But what if Sullivan had accomplices inside the house? What if the guards had been bribed or overpowered? Deciding to trust no one, Bethany slipped from her room and moved silently down the hallway toward the governor's study, where she knew a revolver was kept in the desk drawer. The house was quiet, the dinner guests long gone, the servants retired to their quarters. As she reached the top of the grand staircase, a floorboard creaked behind her. Bethany whirled around to find Sullivan standing there, his disguise abandoned, a knife gleaming in his hand. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "You've led me on quite a chase." Bethany took a step backward, her heel finding the edge of the first stair. How did you get past the guards? Sullivan smiled coldly. Money opens many doors, my dear, as does having friends in high places. He advanced slowly. You should have stayed dead in Aurora. Now I'll have to finish what I started. Bethany glanced behind her, calculating whether she could make it down the stairs before he reached her. Sullivan seemed to read her thoughts. Don't run, he advised. It will only make this more painful. Why are you doing this? Bethany demanded, trying to buy time. I told you, I didn't see anything at the bank. I couldn't identify you or your men. Perhaps, Sullivan conceded, still advancing. But you've become a liability in other ways. Your friend Irving has made it his mission to destroy me. Taking you from him seems a fitting revenge. At the mention of Zachary, Bethany felt a surge of anger replacing her fear. You won't get away with this. The entire territorial government will hunt you down. Sullivan laughed softly. They already are, my dear, but they won't find me. Not until it's too late for you. He lunged suddenly, the knife slashing toward her throat. Bethany threw herself backward, tumbling down several stairs before catching herself on the banister. Sullivan pursued, his face twisted with rage. Bethany scrambled to her feet and fled down the remaining stairs, her robe billowing behind her. She ran for the front door, but Sullivan cut her off, forcing her to change direction. She darted into the dining room, overturning chairs behind her to slow his pursuit. There's nowhere to go, Sullivan called, his voice echoing through the grand house. Everyone is asleep. No one will hear you scream. Bethany grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the sideboard and continued through the kitchen, out the back door and into the garden. The night air was cold against her skin as she ran toward the gate, her one thought to get beyond the walls and find help. She had nearly reached the gate when a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking her path. Bethany raised the candlestick, ready to strike, then froze as familiar eyes met hers. Zach, she gasped. Zachary Irving stood before her, his revolver drawn, his expression grim. Get behind me, Bethany, he ordered, his eyes fixed on something over her shoulder. Bethany glanced back to see Sullivan emerging from the house, knife in hand, his face contorted with fury when he spotted Zachary. Irving, he spat, always interfering. It's over, Sullivan, Zachary replied calmly. Drop the knife and put your hands up. Sullivan's eyes darted between Zachary and Bethany, calculating. You think you've won. This isn't over, not by a long shot. It is for you, Zachary insisted, his revolver steady. The rest of the posse is surrounding the house. There's no escape. For a moment, it seemed Sullivan might surrender. His shoulders slumped slightly, the knife lowering. Then, with frightening speed, he hurled the knife directly at Bethany. Zachary fired as Bethany ducked. The bullet struck Sullivan in the chest, the impact throwing him backward onto the garden path. The knife clattered harmlessly against the gate behind them. Bethany stood frozen, her eyes wide, as Sullivan lay motionless on the ground. Zachary moved forward cautiously, keeping his revolver trained on the outlaw's still form. He kicked the knife well out of reach before checking for signs of life. He's dead, Zachary confirmed, straightening up. The sound of running footsteps announced the arrival of the governor's guards, finally alerted by the gunshot. Close behind them came Marshal Daniels and the other members of Zachary's group. Irving, what happened? The marshal demanded, taking in the scene. Sullivan infiltrated the dinner party earlier this evening, disguised as a judge, Zachary explained. He was after Miss Winters. I arrived just in time to intercept him in the garden. As the marshal organized the removal of Sullivan's body and the questioning of the guards, Zachary turned to Bethany, holstering his revolver. In the moonlight, he could see she was trembling, the adrenaline of her escape beginning to wear off. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. Bethany clung to him, her face buried in his shoulder, the reality of how close she had come to death washing over her in waves. How did you know? she whispered against his shirt. "How did you find me in time?" Zachary drew back slightly, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "We discovered Sullivan had changed direction. I knew he was coming for you." He cupped her face gently. "I promised I'd keep you safe, remember?" Tears filled Bethany's eyes. "You did. You saved me again." "We saved each other," he corrected, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "You kept me alive when that wound got infected." They stood together in the moonlit garden, oblivious to the commotion around them as the household was roused and explanations given. In that moment, there was only the two of them, survivors of a shared ordeal that had forged a bond neither had expected. "It's over now," Zachary said softly. "Sullivan can't hurt you anymore." Bethany nodded, the reality of their newfound freedom beginning to sink in. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Zachary's hand remained on her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "That depends on you," he said. "You can go back to teaching, either in Aurora or somewhere else. You're free to choose your path." "And what about you?" she pressed. "Will you continue bounty hunting?" A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "I've been thinking about that. 7 years is a long time to live on the trail, always moving, always hunting." He paused, then added quietly, "Maybe it's time to put down some roots." Hope blossomed in Bethany's heart. "Where would you do that?" "At your cabin in the mountains, perhaps," Zachary replied. "Though I hear the settlement near the Petersons is growing. Might need someone to keep the peace, establish some law and order." "And they might need a teacher," Bethany suggested, a smile touching her lips. Zachary's eyes softened as he gazed at her. "They might at that." In the distance, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning, the first day of a life without the shadow of Sullivan hanging over them. "Bethany," Zachary said, his voice low and serious. "These past weeks since I found you tied to that post, I've felt more alive than I have in years. You brought something back to me that I thought was lost forever." Bethany's heart raced at his words. "What's that?" she whispered. "Hope," he replied simply. "Hope for a future that includes more than just the next bounty, the next hunt." He took her hands in his. "A future that includes you if you'll have me." Bethany looked up at the man who had saved her life, who had protected her, who had shown her kindness and respect when she needed it most. The connection between them had grown from gratitude into something deeper, something enduring. "I would like that very much," she said softly. Zachary's smile was like the breaking dawn, full of promise and light. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he lowered his head and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that held both a promise and a question. Bethany answered by twining her arms around his neck, returning his kiss with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their eyes shining. "I think," Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion, "that we should speak to the Petersons about that growing settlement of theirs." Bethany nodded, her heart too full for words. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the governor's garden, she and Zachary walked hand in hand toward the house, toward their future, a future neither of them had imagined when fate brought them together on that cold, snowy night in Aurora. 3 months later, the small settlement of New Hope welcomed its first schoolteacher, and Marshall, a married couple who had arrived with little more than their personal belongings, and a shared history that the townsfolk whispered about with fascination. The wedding had been a simple affair at the governor's residence in Denver, with Mrs. Harrington insisting on providing Bethany with a proper dress, and the governor himself giving the bride away. Marshall Daniels had stood as Zachary's best man, and Ruth Peterson had been Bethany's matron of honor. Their new home in New Hope, a sturdy 2-room cabin built by the men of the town, as a wedding gift, stood at the edge of the growing settlement, offering both privacy and proximity to their respective duties. Zachary's days were spent establishing law and order in a community eager for stability, while Bethany taught the children of settlers, miners, and ranchers in a one-room schoolhouse. In the evenings, they would sit on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple. Sometimes they spoke of their ordeal with Sullivan, the fear and danger that had brought them together. More often, they talked of the future of the town's growth, of the children they hoped to have, of the life they were building together. "Any regrets?" Zachary asked one evening as they sat side by side, his arm around her shoulders. "About leaving Aurora. About marrying a former bounty hunter with a cabin in the wilderness," Bethany smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not one," she assured him. "Though I do miss that cabin of yours sometimes. The quiet, the solitude. We could go there," Zachary offered. "When school lets out for summer, spend some time away from everyone." "I'd like that," Bethany said, imagining peaceful days by the stream and starlit nights in the clearing. "Just the two of us." Zachary kissed the top of her head, his voice soft with contentment. "Just the two of us." As darkness settled over New Hope, lights began to appear in cabin windows, marking each family, each life being lived in this remote corner of Colorado territory. Bethany and Zachary remained on their porch, holding each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together on that bitter winter night. From near tragedy had come the greatest blessing of their lives, each other. And as they looked toward the future, they did so not with fear or uncertainty, but with hope and love, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In the years that followed, New Hope grew into a proper town, with a church, a general store, and eventually a small hotel. Bethany's school expanded to 2 rooms, with a second teacher hired to help with the growing number of students. Zachary's reputation as a fair but firm lawman spread throughout the territory, bringing a steady stream of settlers who valued the peace and security he maintained. Their family grew as well. In the spring of 1874, Bethany gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after Zachary's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, little Margaret, named for Zachary's first wife, in a gesture that spoke volumes about Bethany's compassion and understanding. The past was not forgotten but honored, woven into the fabric of their new life together. Zachary occasionally took on special assignments for the territorial governor, tracking particularly dangerous outlaws, but he always returned to New Hope, to Bethany and their children, his true home. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between day and night, Bethany would remember the cold post in Aurora, the rope around her wrists, the despair that had nearly claimed her. Then she would look at her husband, her children, the life they had built, and marvel at how close she had come to losing it all before it even began. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked her one such evening, finding her lost in thought as she stood at their bedroom window. Bethany turned to him, her eyes reflecting the same love and wonder that had been there from the beginning. "I'm thinking about how fortunate I am," she replied simply. "How one moment, one person can change everything." Zachary drew her into his arms, understanding without words. They had both been lost in their own ways, he in his solitary existence, she in her desperate situation. Finding each other had saved them both, giving them a second chance at happiness neither had expected. "I thank God every day that I found you," he murmured against her hair. "That I was there to cut you free and carry me to safety," Bethany added, looking up at him with a smile. "Don't forget that part. You carried me all the way here to this life we've made." Zachary kissed her then, a kiss filled with the certainty of belonging, of having found his true place in the world. Outside their window, New Hope settled into the peaceful rhythms of evening, unaware that its very existence had begun with a desperate act of cruelty, and a moment of unexpected rescue on a cold winter night. For Bethany and Zachary Irving, that rescue had been just the beginning of a journey neither could have imagined, a journey of healing, of discovery, of building a life rich with love and purpose. And as they held each other in the gathering darkness, they were grateful for every step of that journey, even the painful ones, for they had led them here to each other, to home.